Hello everyone and welcome back to the EloEllie podcast. This time we're rejoining you on episode 3, The Environment. This is season 4, the Future Rewritten of the EloEllie podcast. So without further ado, let's get started. So the environment. I don't know how, but it's become a touchy topic for some politicians. Because for some reason, the health of our earth is something that depends on whether you're red or blue, which I frankly think is a bit ridiculous. But before we talk about the politicization of our actual environment, let's first talk about how our US is trying to crack down on the global warming. So global warming is a byproduct of our overall climate change because we have too many greenhouse gases produced by our factories, our cars, and our carbon footprint. We end up sending those greenhouse gases to our ozone layer. And although a certain amount of these greenhouse gases is needed for our sustainment as humans, because it traps heat and keeps us nice and toasty, if we have too much of that greenhouse gas, well, what do you think would happen? All that heat gets trapped and trapped and trapped until it's a little bit too hot for humans to actually live. Which is why we see those videos of the polar bears and the icebergs and how they're melting, is because it's getting hotter. Not technically our temperatures, but the actual gas that we have in our atmosphere. And there's a common misconception that if it's cold outside, there's no global warming. And that could not be any more wrong. Just because it's called global warming doesn't necessarily mean that the temperature is going to be warm automatically. It means that there will be extreme temperature fluctuations. For example, I'm in Los Angeles right now, and it's already June. We passed May, and it was 62 degrees yesterday. It's not summer here yet. And the fact that our summer is supposed to come mid-May is ridiculous in of itself and shows you that climate change is slowly occurring in our temperatures. And when it happens too much and tips us right over the edge, that's when it'll start getting impossibly hot to breathe. But the problem is, if it was just the heat, that would be another issue to deal with, but we also have another byproduct of climate change, which is pollution. Because all the gas that we emit from our factories, our cars, don't only go to make greenhouse gases, they go to pollute our air and water. And there's been an increase in actual asthma that people have been developing because of the bad air, especially in central cities like Los Angeles, Chicago, or New York. And the water is getting increasingly polluted, both with gases, plastics, and trash. Because climate change is not only caused by things that we create, but things that we can't get rid of after creating, like plastic. Even though we recycle, most of the plastic actually goes into landfills, and those landfills seep into the ocean, and that ocean creates and disintegrates that large particle of plastic to become microplastics. And guess what? You can't see microplastics. Not only are sea animals consuming microplastics, but even us humans are consuming about a credit card worth of microplastics every single week. And so, looking at the problem at hand, we can realize that climate change isn't only about, the crazy activists who are destroying art paintings and our old Renaissance portraits. It's a genuine concern about what will happen to our ecosystem for animals, plants, and us humans too. Because if it gets too hot, if we consume too many microplastics, if there's just too much trash in the oceans, well, our water sources, our oxygen sources, our shelters, our earth is obliterated, and we can't successfully live there. And for people like Joe Biden or Donald Trump or some of our other politicians, this doesn't seem like that big of a problem because by the time that actually happens, they probably won't be around. But guess what? Our youth will bear the brunt of the climate harm that we are doing every single day. Because now, climate change is no longer just something that we read about in books. that we read about in the distant future, it's coming up on us. And some researchers even estimate that by 2030 and 2050, it will become a dangerous environment for humans to live on, killing the coral reefs and countless animals all around. So, what is the United States trying to do to alleviate that climate change? So they set the 2030 goal of becoming net zero carbon. And essentially net zero carbon is decreasing our carbon emissions to a net zero, which means that as much as we put in, we also take out. So although the system is continuously cycling, we're not actually adding or subtracting anything from the actual environment. But the problem is that it's already 2024, we're going on to 2025, and we're nowhere near net zero. Even in other countries where they're moving a little bit faster towards their 2030 goal or towards their net zero goal, they've only mobilized about 40%. They still have the majority of their journey left. So the 2030 goal, I don't mean to be too pessimistic, is a little bit unrealistic. And I think that most of our youth would agree so. And the fact in of itself that civilians aren't doing enough to actually help alleviate climate change just continues adding a positive to carbon emissions instead of doing anything to subtract them. Going further, we have the Paris Accords, which is a climate agreement with different countries, and we also have our UN affiliation made for climate. And what the US does every few years is we meet together in our COP X number. And the COP stands for Climate Conference. And the Climate Conference happens all over the world in various places with different countries like France, Italy, Switzerland, the US. And occasionally, if we're lucky enough, we get some of those communism countries like China to join us and talk about the environment. Because if our Earth is destroyed, then there's really no merit in making a big government because everyone is going to be burnt half to death. So what we have to look at is what we're going to do in our next COP, which is happening in 2024. It's called the COP 29 because everyone is aiming towards 2029. And they're essentially going to once again talk about carbon emissions, renewable energy. But the problem is we've had these kinds of discussions in the past and clearly not enough has happened. So this means that civilians need to start making change. But in order for the civilians to feel incentivized to make change, we need our politicians to talk about climate change. When presidential candidates or even our president is asked about climate change, he lets us know that it's an important problem that we need to address, which I think most of us know by now, but there are no actual valid actions or opinions made on the issue, which is where the youth are trying to step in. Yes, some of our activists for climate change do get the message a little bit convoluted, decide to throw non-environmentally friendly paints at Renaissance paintings, and even myself, I don't know what the purpose of that is. But when I'm talking about climate activism, I'm talking about spreading awareness, decreasing, and doing the 3 R's that we learned about when we were in elementary school. Recycle, reuse, and in doing so, we take a step-by-step plan of decreasing the carbon footprint that each human individual leaves. And honestly, the youth have been made fun of for trying to make climate change goals and trying to make an activism group because at a certain point the message, like some of our climate activists today, gets a little bit convoluted. We're talking about boycotting Starbucks, we're talking about using tote bags, not using plastic straws, saving the turtles in 2019. But it becomes more of an internet fad than an actual environmentally friendly movement, which is something that we should all try to change. So instead of pointing fingers at the youth and saying, you're not doing anything for the environment, perhaps it's time that we talk about it and we take action as a group. But what I also want to talk about is tornadoes, hurricanes, and storms. We've had a lot of hurricanes and tornadoes go past the United States, some of them extremely devastating. But the biggest byproduct of climate change that we can see as of right now is an increased cause of natural disasters. Earthquakes, fires, hurricanes, storms, those are exacerbated and increased because of climate change. Things are too dry, and it seems like the perfect environment to just light something up. And boom, everything is on fire. And a recent CNN article, if I can find the link, I'll link it in the description, that I read talked about how there's going to be an expected increased amount of storms this year. And although this is concerning for those living in the region, this is also concerning as a whole because the more storms increase, the more wildfires increase, the more natural disasters actually happen, the more our environment that the youth are going to grow up in is destroyed. The environment isn't just a policy about the animals, about the plants, about whether this is a Republican or Democratic side. That doesn't matter anymore. What matters is the youth, the people who are going to live in this environment, on this earth. And unfortunately, not enough is being done to preserve this environment. So whereas for my lifetime, I may be lucky enough to not watch a mass apocalypse of the earth, in 100 years, in 200 years, which is just barely 2 more generations, the earth could easily crack down. And what I lastly want to talk about is renewable energy. Because we can't talk about climate change without talking about renewable energy. Renewable energy combines things like solar energy, wind energy, water energy, and what it does is not provide an alternative, but it actually is supposed to be a complete replacement. It's not an option A or B and you use C if you want. It needs to be, instead of an A and B, we use option C. Our current options A and B are oil and gas. Our petroleum industry overall is helping fuel our energy grids and everything that we do. But the oil causes all of that pollution, all of that climate change, all of that greenhouse gas that we talked about just a minute ago. So what we're trying to completely replace it with is renewable energy. Solar panels, hydro panels, wind panels, and even looking into things like nuclear energy, we're trying to create energy that we can renew every now and then, and is produced naturally by the environment. But like most things, this has become another political issue. A lot of Democrats, or those who usually identify with the Democratic Party, want more renewable energy. They want to change our oil industries to renewable energy industries. However, those who usually identify with the Republican Party don't want to get rid of our oil industry. They say reasons such that there are a lot of workers within the oil industry that we would be jeopardizing, which is true. But another big reason is that we have a lot of politicians who have invested in the oil industry, and if we change that to renewable energy, they would lose their money. A lot of politicians who invest in oil and don't want to change over to renewable energy for this reason think that the youth don't know about the money-making scheme, but we're all aware. We're simply choosing to ignore it as of right now because we think that we need to tackle down on our climate. But in order to start that change, we need to crack down on those very same people who are extorting money out of the business and refusing to lose that money. We also have competition with China when it comes to renewable energy because China, despite making the most pollution in the world, similar to the United States, is the #1 leader in renewable energy. So yes, they're making a lot of greenhouse gases, but also at the same time, they're making the most amount of renewable energy products, making the most progress. So we need to take their example in their investments into renewable energy. Overall, the climate change goal isn't something that we can do alone as the United States of America. It needs to be a community effort. And this might require us getting stronger with our allies and with our enemies. But if we even want to fight over territories, we kind of need to have the land to fight over. the youth are trying to get together multiple environmental movements all around the world. I mean, I myself have done research on microplastics and trying to solve the problem of the mass pollution of them within the ocean. But if politicians and those in power don't listen to the youth when they talk about climate change, when they talk about possible solutions, and shield it off with, you don't understand because you're not a politician, or this is a political issue that we can't just waddle around, well then, we can't get anything done. This is my opinion and someone who's speaking for a lot of youth voices. And there's always a variety of opinions that you can find online that hopefully you can have a discussion in the future. But this is one input on how our US environment and the overall global environment is going to change the future for the youth. And this is one thing that the youth need to rewrite if we want to have a future generation. Thank you so much for joining us for episode 3, talking about the environment. Our next episode will be pertaining to the economy, and the episode after that will be pertaining to education, both very important topics for the youth. And hopefully I'll see you again on episode 4, which will come out either tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. And you can always find me on 2eloquentellie@gmail.com, 2eloellie.com, and on other episodes. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'll see you next time.